Hey everybody, welcome back. This is going to be a video on how to basically take somebody's request to help them with their session file to get a much more clean and dynamic looking render. So you can see right here, it started from something like this to something like this. So let's go ahead and get started right now. So whenever I'm going to help somebody out, the best thing that I can do is just have the file to take a look at so I can actually look around, observe, see what the potential issues is, and all of that. So if you can just jump on the Discord, the links are going to be down in the video description, but it's also in the information link in the YouTube channel. But you can get on there, and if you have questions or you need help or something, you can always post your session, and that's the easiest way to get help. But we're going to look at this one here. And they were having a lot of issues with the materials on their diamonds. So you can see here that it looks like they're trying out a couple different materials. Nothing seems to be working. And they have their necklace and their scene here. So let's start to dive into just some of the things that I look for and what I think everyone should look for to begin with. So first thing, let's just do this right here and collapse that. Let's just take a look at the scene itself. So I like to just kind of look around and see what kind of environment they have here. And you can see that they're using a HDRI. You can see that there's some stuff back here, and it's inside of a sort of like lighting studio with a white backdrop over here and some lights over here. And you can tell that it's a little bit low quality as far as the image size because you could see some pixelation probably on your screen here. And that's not too bad. That will just happen sometimes and it's totally usable. But one of the issues that I can see here is that there's a lot of this black that's going on over here. And if we look at the ceiling, you can see that there's some black. Oh, there looks like some soundproofing panels and stuff too. So there's just some black in this scene that's going to be reflected on the metal and everything else. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's unusable. So what we can do if you want to alter some of those things is we can go into the world settings and let's just take a look at what's done here. And what it looks like is that this is probably an environment texture, but the problem is there when it's connected, it's just straight into this surface, which really isn't the right way to set this up. So to reset this, if we go over to the world properties over here and we just close that, and what we're going to do is we are going to select background first, like this. And that's going to create this sort of like color here with a strength that's right underneath it, which is kind of what we were missing in the overall node setup before. And then if we click on the color right here, we can go to environment texture, and then we can select that same studio right from in there, turn the strength up to a 1, and there we have the environment texture set up a little bit easier so that we can actually use this strength here to increase or decrease the value. But what you can also do is you can take the in between the background and your environment texture here. If you go in to add a color RGB curves right in between the two, you can actually change how this is done. So you can make it more dramatic by adding this curve here, which will make the lights a lot brighter and the darks darker. So you're just adding contrast there, which can brighten up your scene quite a bit because it's making it a lot more dynamic with a lot more light. And we can go the opposite way by doing this right here. And what that does is it kind of pulls the contrast out of the scene, so the blacks become a little bit grayer, and we're actually brightening up the scene altogether like that, which can help to just sort of flatten out the coloring in your scene. If you need a little bit more flat so that your actual lights that are in the scene do a little bit more work instead of your environment texture. Now, we are having some interesting issues with the materials here, and one of those issues is that we are seeing the denoiser right here. So I'm going to turn off the denoise right there, and that's going to allow us to see this a little bit easier. And there they have all their different materials as well, and I'm actually going to remove some of that. But just in general, the environment will have kind of a deciding factor on what the overall lighting is going to be on your scene. And if we turn this down to a 0, you can see that there's nothing happening here because there's no lighting in the scene. So I would definitely recommend that this person add a spot lamp and move it up like this, and play around with your values, something like this here. And that is going to sort of like start to set off any of the dispersion effects that you have in your materials. So what I did in the fix that I will show you in a little bit, if I take this and I move it here like that, and I duplicate it again and rotate it around like this and just have it kind of set up in general, sort of like this, where it's showcasing the area right here in front and then the strength of the background light, put it at 0.25 or something. The shot in general, if I look in the camera, you can see, whoops, it looks like the lock camera to view is on. If we look at it like this, you can see that now what's centered and what's being showcased is what's lit up here. We'll just turn off the overlays. But you can see like the lighting patterns and stuff is sort of like showcasing that specific area. It's a little bit disjointed here because of all these different materials, but that's okay. The next thing that I'm going to look at is I'm going to take all of these right here, and we're going to make them the same material just to make things a little bit simpler. And I'm just going to pick this more simple one that's right in the middle there, and I'm going to hit Control L to link the materials, and now they're all the same material like that, okay? The dispersion effect is actually being done by this right here. And I only know that because I've opened this before. So this should actually not be a dispersion effect down in here. This backing right here should be a metal. So let's just change that. That might have just been a mistake. So we're going to change that to the silver. And you can see that we have a more what you would expect to see for a glass material right on the top here. So no dispersion, which we'll go into later. Another thing that can kind of help with your glass material is that you could see if we look at it, it's pretty dark, and that's because glass does cast a shadow. And the shadow that's being cast, if we just sort of let's just take this right here and this ground plane, and I'm going to hit forward slash just to isolate those two items. And let's just zoom in down here at the one. And you can see that there's a shadow that's being cast. And the floor is a little bit far away, but you can see the shadow that's down there, right? So that's being cast inside of the thing that's in. So if it's in a ring or if it's in some sort of enclosure or something like that, it's going to look a little bit darker because the glass itself actually does cast a shadow. So what we need to do is we need to mitigate that. And how we do that is we actually need to take the a mix shader like this and put this into there like that. We're going to just take a look at the mix shader. We're going to add a transparency, so transparent like this. Put that in the top for now. And what we want for the factor here, instead of this just being like a true or false value to go between the transparency or the principled BSDF, what we need to do is we need to tell this node setup down here that we want the shadow down here to become transparent. And how we do that is by going to Shift A to add for if you have Node Wrangler installed, go to light path, and then, whoops, take this right here, take the shadow ray like this, put it right in there. And it looks like these are swapped, so you could just take these, switch them around, and then what you can do is you can see that if I make this black, the shadow shows up down there, and if I make it white, the shadow is then removed. So if I hit forward slash again, and we take a look at everything here, if we take this and make it black, you can see that the shadow's there. If you just take a look at this right here, the shadow's there and the shadow's not there. So that will help brighten up your diamonds or your jewelry or whatever it is if you do that. Another thing you can do is obviously you can add a bevel inside of your modifiers panel over here. But if you want to do this as far as just your shading, what's really, really fun to do is if you do a search here for bevel, and you're in cycles render, you can actually take this, and if we look through this with Node Wrangler, you can take a look really closely. You see this edge right here? If we take the radius and we move it up, you can see how soft that gets, and if we move it down, it gets more harsh. So if you take that normal and you just put it into the normal value for your principled BSDF there, you can see that it's going to bevel that. So we can take that and we can set a really nice little bevel right at the corner there, and that's going to bevel all of these inside of the material instead of actually adding data by doing a modifier here. So that's a really good way of just softening up your jewelry or any edges that you have, whether it's a metallic object like this right here, or your jewel pieces like these diamond shapes here. It's a nice way of adding that bevel shape without too much trouble. or increasing the size of the project that you're working in. Another thing that you'll want to do, and I'm just going to close this down here and move this over like this, and we're just going to look at this from the solid view. If I look at the front view like this, you can see why the flooring is so far away. There's a chain here, and this artist did a really great job. They used an array, which I'm not going to show on this. They used an array, they fit it to the curve, and they were able to make this chain based on, if we go into edit mode, based on this right here. So you guys can see that chain. Looks kind of weird, but there it is right there, okay? I'm actually going to take that array off, so there's the chain. So the array that's being created here, if we go back into object mode, is on this curve. But the problem is you can see that it's straight up and down, and if we take this floor and go to a front view and grab it on Z and pull it up to the bottom of the plate here for the diamonds, the chain is going through. So that's a little bit of a problem, right? Well, what you can do with curves, and this is something that I show in my fantasy ring tutorial series, if you go into edit mode and you take these points right here, whether you're using this right here, which is more of like a geometric shape way of doing curves, and it sort of fits the curve. I'll show you. If I take this and I hit G to grab that and I move it, you can see that I'm moving it based on sort of this geometric constraint here. But if you go down here to the tool where it says tilt and you click that, you get a different set of options. And if I zoom in just on this section over here, zoom out a little bit, you can actually take this and you can change the tilt angle. See that? So you can actually set this to lie on the actual ground. You don't have to do what he had done before, which was like pull the ground really far away. And you can take this one over here and you can rotate that and shift that around. And the same thing with this side over here. You can rotate this and shift it around and adjust this as needed. And I would recommend actually taking this and subdividing it a few times, maybe something like this, and playing with just kind of like making it a little bit more messy. Like, not everything has to be more perfect, and sometimes making it less perfect makes it look perfect, if that makes any sense. Like, whenever something looks, quote, placed, it might look a little bit too much like someone was trying to take a photo or something like that. And a lot of times, to convince people of the reality of something, especially in CG, you might want to, make it a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more interesting with the shape, maybe something like that. That way it looks a little bit less placed and a little bit more like it was sort of dropped on the ground or something like that to be displayed. So I think that that can add a lot to the realism of your image as well. Another thing to sort of point out here is if we look at the actual base plate item here, it appears that this is just a sort of like 2D. It is three-dimensional, but it doesn't really have, if I isolate this, it doesn't really have a lot of geometry to it. It's very it's very thin, and everything has some sort of depth to it. So I would add a solidify modifier to this, maybe pull it in this direction here, make it an even thickness or something like that. Control A to apply the scale, just in case it looks like there was some scaling there, making the solidify look a little bit weird. But you can see on the edge here that we do have some depth here, and if we hit / again, we can see that we at least have something going on there as far as the overall depth is concerned. Another thing, it looks like these right here, if we right click shade smooth, you can see that these are all have some flat shading. So we need all of these here, which I'm not going to show you, but you would select all those, make them into a smooth shading, and then go over here to the object data properties, click on auto smooth, and you can see there it made this look really, really nice. That little cap right there looks a lot better. So I would definitely recommend doing that for all of these. You'll get a much more realistic render if you do that. It also looks like we have some doubled stuff over here, so I'm just going to delete this one, and that should fix that issue there. Another thing to sort of point out is that this background may be cool for if you're going for just a stark black or white. However, let's do something a little bit different. So I'm just going to split the panel here and take a look at the shader editor. It looks like there isn't actually a material on this, so let's just click new And instead of a base color of white and using the BSDF, what I'm actually going to do is use a velvet. So we can add a velvet here. And I think velvet looks really nice. It's nice and flat. And let's look at this in the rendered view. It's nice and flat, and what we can do is add a neat little color. See how like that just makes this look so much nicer when you add that little bit of color. It's not it's still sort of monochrome because there's only one color in the scene. We're not making it too complex with a bunch of stuff going on. But that color, I don't know if that's the Tiffany blue or something like that, but this sort of blue color really works, or this like more lighter gray. Something like that really can make a piece stand out because it sort of gives a mood to it. And you can use like an orange or a red or something if you think that that matches what you're trying to do. But I really do think that adding a little bit of a color like this really helps your jewelry look a little bit more interesting. Okay, so I definitely would recommend doing something like that. The other thing that I would recommend when it comes to your materials is that you don't just use the regular built-in shaders for glass. You kind of, in order to do gemstones and to get this sort of dispersion effect without having to use another render engine that does this automatically, you do need to create this on your own or get a node set up from somebody else. So I do have some project files that use the Jokafa fancy glass that you see right here, the JCF fancy glass, which is really fantastic. This is actually featured in one of my videos, so I will link that below, as well as the other jewelry videos that I've done that use this shader. And you can maybe download one of my project files if you want to see how I do that, and other materials if you'd like. But you can see here that it adds that dispersion effect really easily. You can easily change the dispersion amounts. You can easily change the glass color, and you can have all sorts of things that really change the overall look of your gemstones just by doing some really, really quick, easy changes to these. So I do recommend that you jump over and you download that. It's completely free from Jokafa, so you don't have to worry about paying anything. My project files do have a $1 fee, but if you want the node just for free, you can grab that, and I will try to provide the link down in the video description. Another thing you're going to want to do is in your render settings over here, you really need to make sure that you take your light paths here. And if you're going to use this method, make sure that you increase your glossy and your transmission, maybe to 16 or something like that to get it. But I do recommend doing the fast GI approximation because this is really accurate. But you can see here that when I turned it on, take a look. You see how it's very dark? So if I remove that and then I put it back on, you see how it's really dark, right? That's because you can see here it says viewport bounces and then render bounces. So you need to turn this up to like 16 or something, at least 12, and you can get more of the proper effect there. And then in the render bounces, make this a 0 so that when you render it, it's the same as your viewport. And you can see there that that is looking a lot nicer than it was before. We probably would need to increase the lighting, but I'll talk about that in just a second. So next thing here that we want to take a look at is just the amount of lighting that's in your scene. So a lot of people just sort of throw lights in, they render it, add a glare or something like that, and they find that it might be a little bit difficult to adjust some things. So what you really want to get into the habit of doing is going into your render settings here. So render properties, and where it says view transform, change this to false color. And what it does is it brings up this sort of like color map here to show you what's going on in your scene. And I'm just going to change this so that we just look at this rendered section here. And if we zoom in a little bit, do you see these red spots right here? That's where the brightest points are. And anywhere that's more of a gray value or these more blue values, those are going to be darker areas. And you can adjust this, and you can see here that I'm not going to go into right now, but I would definitely recommend that you clean up your file and put a lot of these together into the same things, the same groups. But if we take a look at the lights here, so if I grab this light, for example, and let's just add some zeros to this. So you see how that got really red right in there. And if I go to the render settings and I put this on standard, not filmic, but standard, you see how bright that is? And that might look cool. You might be like, hey, that's awesome. That's exactly what I want. Okay, cool. That's fine. If you want to do that, that's totally fine. The problem here is that those super bright areas, you're basically going into a color that, as far as the color information, the brightness value is going so far into the bright that you're never really going to be able to bring that back when you do some compositing or when you change the color the sort of like film coloring that you end up doing at the end, you're not going to be able to bring some of those colors back. So when you see in the false color view transform, when you see these super red areas, so if I take, for example, the environment light and I put this up to a 2.5 or something, you see how much of this got yellow and red? And if we go back to this and we change this back to standard, a lot of this is going to be really bright. So if you want something that's super bright that you can't pull back on those values, that's completely fine. But you just should know that you're doing that before you actually make those decisions. So don't make this sort of haphazard when you do your lighting. You can use this. You can see it went to megawatts here, but you can change this to something a little bit more manageable. Let's try something like that. So you can get that arc going on if you like that. And the same thing in regards, I'm sorry that this is all here, but you guys might want to make sure that you check your files before for that kind of thing. But make sure that you see how crazy that is. So if I didn't have that in mind, that there was going to be those sort of issues with the false color, you might just be throwing values in here and just thinking, oh, that looks fine, and not really understanding that when you get those super bright sections that you might run into some issues. So just keep that in mind when you're building out your lighting. You shouldn't have too much that's like overpowering. You shouldn't have too much red going on, unless you really want those areas to just like stand out as like really bright. Okay. So just keep that in mind. Use this false color to help guide you as you're doing your lighting. And then that way, when you do your glare and you add any glow effects, you'll understand why the glow map is pulling those specific areas and not others. So if we just take a quick look at the actual project file that I created, here is what it looks like. You can see that I have these lamps overhead like that. I've sort of changed the way that the camera is set. And if we look at this in the rendered view, you can see that this is how I've made it look. And if we look at our diamonds here, I am using the JCF Fancy Glass, and I am using the shadow ray removal and everything else like we already discussed, as well as the velvet and all that. So that is really how I would recommend doing this type of scene. And you can see here that with the ground, I made it a darker color, and it looks really neat. So let's go ahead and we're going to do a quick render, and I'll show you some quick color ideas. So here's what the render looks like. I just did a really quick render. There's still some noise, but it's going to work just for what we're trying to do here. So I'm just going to move this to my other screen, and let's take a look at the compositing tab, and I'll explain to you what I did here. So if we take a look at this, and you can see it's in the background there. So what I did here is I have this right here. You can see that here is the image when I did the original render. And as we change some things here, this color balance right here, if I look through the color balance, you can see that I moved the lift up, I moved the gamma down a little bit, and I moved the gain up, and I also added some blue right here. And right here in the gamma, I used a little bit of orange or some reddish colors. And then with this right here in the lift, I added a little bit of blue value as well. So if we zoom in really close, you can see that on the color wheel, I made those couple adjustments. And how you can make those adjustments, if you opened up the render view that kind of opens up and you change it to the viewer node, what you can do is you can look in the scopes here and you can bring down the waveform monitor like this. You see this right here? This is the overall luminance values that we're looking at here, or the brightness and darkness in the color values. And you can adjust the lighting or adjust the coloring and the contrast and everything according to this waveform monitor right here to help you adjust for what kind of tone you're going for. So for example, if you wanted to make this more dynamic by adding contrast, you can pull this gamma down a bit and then pull this lift up a little bit like this. And you can see here, I was able to see this, but this in the waveform monitor will change. So this right here is the darks, this up here is the lights. And what you kind of want to do is have a nice range in between the two. This red line, or this very faint red line for you guys, that's kind of like if you're crushing blacks, meaning you're going way down in there. So I'll show you what that kind of looks like. If I take this down like this, you can see how dynamic that is. There's a huge range going on. We have the blacks are all the way down here, and the whites are all the way up there. So we're increasing that, but at the same time, everything else is getting a little bit too dark. So to counter that, you can add some gain, which will increase certain values. And if you just hover over some of these things, you can see that it says right there, gain correction for highlights, gamma correction for midtones, and lift correction for shadows. So if you wanted to bring those shadows up a bit because they were a little bit too crushed, you can just go boop like that, or a little bit more maybe, and then take a look at that. And now we have overall the tone has moved up this way, and the blacks are still, some of them are down in there, like that right there. But you can see that we've also moved the overall tone up on this whole thing here, and there's a lot more up in this white section than there was before. So that's kind of how you can adjust the coloring effects here with this color balance node. I see a lot of people on with Blender tutorials talk about this just really briefly, and they just do some stuff, but I never really understood it. So hopefully that helps you understand that. Then for this color correction here, I just pulled some of the saturation down, which sort of just helps bring out some of the over blue colors or something like that. And maybe it's a little too much still. So a 0.9 or something like that might help. And you can see here, it just pulls out some of that oversaturated color. And then you can save that out as your image there. So thanks so much for watching, everybody. I hope this really helped you understand how you can take a file where you're having some issues and concerns and really helps you to fix the jewelry so that you can render it out the way that you really, really want it to look. If you have any other questions, of course, place the comments or questions down below in this video and I can try and get back to you as quickly as possible, or you can jump on the Discord. Thanks so much to all my members and to my patrons. You guys are all awesome. Thank you so much. And I will see you all next time on DJ Tutorials.